Father, thank you for every life that is here, for the fact that you loved us enough to send your Son to die, that you are the creator of all things, that in you we have our being. Pray that your Spirit will be amongst us today and that our hearts will be open to whatever it is that you would say to us. These things in your name. Amen.
You're cutting out a little.
Am I cutting out? Okay, sorry. So we got a little high tech here, and we have some pictures for you. This is the James Webb Telescope that we're talking about last week. It's a rendering, but very, very close to what it looks like. Next slide. So if you get on the internet, you will see all kinds of pictures that have been taken by this telescope about the universe. Now, to be technical, this telescope doesn't pick up color, but what it does do is it picks up a type of light, and then from calculations creates this, what is likely the colors that are there. It's just so incredible and so impressive what we're seeing from this telescope, and again gives us just the beginning of a look into the vastness and the incredible universe that we exist in, that we didn't know about 100 years ago. And so this next decade of information coming in cosmology is just going to be so much fun for us as Christians, because we're going to just see what God has created in his universe. Today we're going to talk about biology. I think I'm still cutting out, Eva.
Yeah, the biology, the study of living organisms, is the subject today. Much of the conflict between faith and science plays out in the battlefield of biology. Every worldview begins with the question of how did we get here? If there's no creator, we must be the result of random mutations acted upon by natural selection. We're nothing more than a stepping stone to the next evolutionary advancement. In contrast, if there is a creator, and that creator is the God of the Bible, we are made in his image to create as he created, love as he loved, and to affect things for eternity. So there's a big difference there.
So in college, I enjoyed having debates on this subject with my secular classmates and hallmates. And one of my Christian friends came up to me and said, this is probably not what you ought to be doing. It's not salvific. It may be irritating, and maybe you should think about other topics. And I thought about it for a bit, and I thought, I think you're right. These debates about the origin of life and man may not be as important as I thought. I've changed my mind again. Yeah. and the idea is that it is in fact fundamental to who we are and what we are from the perspective of our Creator. Now, is it as important as understanding the details of the Sermon on the Mount? I don't know, maybe. But I do think that on this mountaintop of science, the scientists have created this God that should be worshipped, and that mountain is crumbling, and they know it's crumbling. And again, as we've said time and time again on Sunday morning, we need to be there ready for those people who are tumbling down this hill, and it's going to happen a lot. Now, Dr. James Tour, he's probably the world's most authority on nanotechnology, and he's a Christian. They interviewed college graduates and asked the question, how many of you believe in the laboratory that a living cell has been created? 1/3 of college graduates who were interviewed said yes. A third. I'm sorry, 2/3. 1/3.
You want to just use this one?
Yeah, thank you. 1/3 said a frog has been created in the laboratory. A frog. Now, that's where we are scientifically right now with our college students. They have been so indoctrinated to this idea that evolution has happened, that we've been able to create life in the laboratory to the extent that we can create frogs. We know that, as we talk about this morning, we're going to find out not only have we not created frogs, we haven't created anything. Not one thing related to living cells.
When Darwin wrote about the origin of species, not the origin of life, he presumed that life already existed. So then the question since then has been, okay, where did life come from? And even the Big Bang theorists don't propose that life came from that. They propose that elements that are required for life may have come from that. And those elements are amino acids, fatty acids, carbohydrates, and nucleotides.
Could I have that next slide? So how many of you have heard of the Miller-Urey experiment? 1952, University of Chicago, I have one hand. If I tell you about it, you probably have heard about it. And so what they did was they created this prebiotic primordial slime, and then they put some electricity through it. And they came up with a few amino acids that were unstable and happened to be right-handed instead of left-handed. And if you know anything about amino acids, you know that doesn't work. 1952. So what has happened since 1952 with respect to creating amino acids? Anything? Nothing. They have been working as diligently as they possibly can, and not one thing has happened in that number of years. So we are unable to create anything in the laboratory, least of all a frog. All right, so Richard Dawkins, which we've talked about several times, probably the foremost atheist evolutionary biologist in the world right now, and Francis Crick, who we'll talk about in a second, they both were so surprised or impressed by the idea that life came about that they called it a miracle. And in fact, they both came up with this idea called panspermia. And panspermia means that life came from somewhere else to the earth. That started the process, and then we had evolution. Now, kicking the can down the road, right? Because where did that life then come from? There's no explanation. All they did was to say, it's not possible, it couldn't have happened here, it was a miracle, but it could have possibly happened somewhere else 2 billion years ago. All right. We cannot overemphasize the importance of Darwin in this whole idea. So in 1859, he wrote The Origin of the Species. What's important to know is that it was origin of the species, not origin of life. So he assumed that life had already existed, and then began this idea about, okay, once we have life present, which we didn't have and couldn't have, and it's impossible, this is how things progressed. And his idea was you have small mutations that offer an advantage, a survival advantage, that then get incorporated in the creature, that then transforms them over millions of years to become something new. And so that's called natural selection.
Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications my theory would absolutely break down.
So I asked last week, was Darwin afraid of the eye? And the answer is absolutely yes. He knew that the eye was complex. He didn't know how complex, but he was afraid that the eye would be the undermining of his theory. The eye was the least of his problems, and we'll come to that in a minute as with respect to when you get into the inner workings of the cell and you understand that there is no such thing as a simple cell. See, when he thought about cellular structures, he thought it was just a glob of protoplasm. And if you simply have just a little bit of a glob and you couldn't see inside what was going on, then sure, that makes sense that it was simple, but we know now that it is nothing compared to, I mean, it's not simple at all. It is far, far more complex than he could possibly have imagined. Side note, Darwin not only affected our understanding of how we got here, but he had a lot of disciples, and Marx was one of them. So Darwin's idea is that we would start simply and progressively become better. That was Marx's idea as well. He was an economist, and he believed that we could progressively get better economically. But then numerous people since him have also thought, well, we can get better socially as well. And so he has many disciples, and Darwin is so influential in our thinking today that it is important that we look at his ideas, his science, and his philosophy and say, it no longer is possible what you believed.
Okay, so there are 3 types of evolution: microevolution, which is small adaptive changes that can produce changes in a species written in the genetic code. Macroevolution, small adaptive changes can accumulate to produce a new species over a long period of time. And then
theistic evolution, and we'll talk about that in a second. But microevolution, so you've all heard about the finches and how they change their beak size and all of that. Those are minor changes within the organism itself that allow for adaptive changes. They are already written in their genetic code. This is not a change that is happening. And so we certainly believe in microevolution. We believe that animals can adapt. What we do not believe is that minor adaptations then can create this macroevolutionary idea where these small changes then become an entirely new species. So I'm going to proceed with a little bit of fear when we talk about theistic evolution. Last week, I didn't take a stand at all on the age of the earth. I don't think my position is important enough to warrant any kind of conflict. I have no sense about that with respect to theistic evolution. I will take a stand. And I think as Christians, we should take a stand. Now, if you have troubles with my theology or my science, I will give you an opportunity at the end to rebut my position on that. Perfectly open to that idea. All right. So the idea behind theistic evolution is that, in fact, God used the evolutionary process to go from simple cells to man and all types of plants and animals. So, and I hear this from Christians all the time. Well, maybe he just used this process. Now, the problem is, and I will ask for a show of hands, or maybe a comment, when did entropy begin? Second law of thermodynamics, where sin entered the world, the universe no longer was perfect, and now we had death. When did that take place? I got an apple biter back there. I have a fruit biter. What's that? With the fall. Theistic evolution would have to argue that death came prior to the fall of man, and that then that death was not the result of sin, So what did Christ's death do for death? So I do not think we can have a position, and again, I'll be happy to hear your thoughts on this. We can have a position where we take the theistic evolutionary stand. Okay. All right, so if we have an opportunity to peer into the cell, and we talked about that a little bit ago, there are some discoveries that occurred in the 50s and now occurring every day in science, and one of those is the double helix that Watson and Crick developed in 1953. Can you put that picture up? Okay, so this was just absolutely brilliant. The idea that DNA has in it these very complex chemicals. I mean, and this is a tiny, tiny strand, so you can see how complex just that picture is. But what is more important is that in 1958, the idea of a sequence hypothesis came about, and that was Crick. So not only do we have the structures of DNA, but what we have within that structure is information. So when the DNA unwraps, and then you have another, it's called RNA, messenger RNA, attaches to it, it then comes off and goes and makes proteins. So what we have now is not that the DNA in and of itself does anything, but it contains information. And that information then gets translated into creating every aspect of the cell. So anytime we look at something and we say, that is information, that is code, we know there had to be a writer. Because never do we have a textbook without a writer. Never do we have a carving without a carver. Never do we have an incredible piece of pottery without a potter. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So the idea here is that we are now peering into the cell and finding information, and that is critical to our position.
So Bill Gates said, DNA is like a computer program, except more sophisticated. What many of us were taught, and I think are still taught, is that there's a diagram called the tree of life, and it shows that all species came from one organism. But what now we know through the study of DNA is that we would need a forest of trees for that to work, to possibly account for the species that we know.
Okay, next slide. So we're going to go back to this simple cell. And, you know, Darwin had no idea that this simple bacterium would look like this. It looks anything but simple. And so you see those little long, hairy things on it. Those are called flagella. And that allows the bacteria to move. Next slide. This is one of them. All right, so this looks like a motor, right? Like a rotor. And it has within it 30 proteins. Now, each protein has 3,000 letters. So you do the math as to how much information is written into the code to make one flagella. So this is complicated, sophisticated cellular stuff that we're now learning as we dig into the depths of the cell. And this is just one of many. This is not even close to the complexity of the mitochondria, which is inside the cell. So anytime someone uses the word simple cell, you can just simply think to yourself, there is no such thing. God created this incredible complexity that we're now beginning to see more and more as we dig into the understanding of the cell. So what Darwin was afraid of with the eye is something called irreducible complexity. And what that means is that if you think about it as a mousetrap, if you have any component missing, it doesn't work. If you have any protein missing in that motor, it doesn't work. And there are no advantages to having 28 proteins to make a flagella, or 15. So you have 15 proteins, kind of looks like a flagella. Maybe if we add 15 more, we'll get one. Well, there's no reason why that 15 protein thing works at all. It doesn't work. So it doesn't offer an advantage, and it doesn't exist. So there is nothing that can happen in the stages up to the development of that would offer an advantage. That's called irreducible complexity. That destroys neo-Darwinism, and they know it, and this is happening right now across the world.
Want me to do? Okay. So the information argument is, if in fact, as Gates suggests, this is a computer code, a written language, then there must be a writer, a coder. If you want to alter the code, you must add code. There's not one example of mutations adding to genetic code. If you have a 3D printer and you want to make a plastic spoon, you must tell it what to do with instructions in the form of code.
We have a very good friend who runs a company that makes artificial hips and joints. So we've actually toured his factory. So he starts with this piece of metal, and then someone has written code to tell that laser piece of equipment to cut out that special joint out of that piece of metal. That doesn't happen. You don't just happen along and find a third of a joint that pretty soon, in 10 million years, you'll have another joint. He has specific code creating those special joints out of a piece of metal. Okay, so we'll move away from the cell and talk about the fossil record. So there were a few that thought there's enough fossil record to at least give some credence to evolutionary process. So we'll talk about some of those things. You probably heard of something called the Cambrian explosion, and so this has been going on for a long time. In fact, Darwin knew about this. And if you look at these digs all around, you will find that all of a sudden, sophisticated things came about. Plants, fish, dinosaurs, mammals, all happened. They just occurred. And in the Precambrian era, there's no evidence of any precursors that would have led to a crocodile. And the other thing that happens is that once you see the Cambrian explosion, all of these new things being created, a crocodile remains a crocodile. This plant remains the same. And they don't see, and they call it stasis, that it happened and then it remains. This thing happened and it remains. And so we don't have a decent fossil record at all that would suggest that the evolutionary process happened. And again, if someone says that, you can just ask, okay, tell me where you're getting this. You know, inform me as to what, where you're reading this. What paper did you look at? So so the secular scientists agree with this. This is in fact true, that the Cambrian explosion happened. So how do we explain it? And there's something called punctuated equilibrium. And that is the evolutionary process starts and stops, fits and starts. So it happened and then it stopped. And then it happened again and then it stopped. But that goes totally against the entire idea of evolution, where it's a gradual process over millions and billions of years. So Stephen Jay Gould, who was the one that came up with this, who has now since passed, that was his scientism to explain how you get past this difficult fossil record. All right, what about all of these pre-human fossils that we've discovered? The Piltdown man in 1912, they found him in the Piltdown area. What they did was that they filed off his teeth to make him look human, when in fact he was an ape. So that was an absolute hoax. They discovered this hoax. How about Nebraska man? He was the tooth of a pig. Cro-Magnon man, Peking man, Java man, all had held a high position for a while and have since lost favor. Lucy is the current one. And Lucy was named because the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky was playing at the time that they discovered Lucy. It still remains rather firmly ingrained in the science of evolution. However, it is also beginning to have troubles, and it's crumbling as well. So there are no good, honest fossil records to suggest that there was a transition from apes to men.
Okay, so hearing all this, the theory of intelligent design really goes like the key features of living systems that we're discovering are best, I think this is being discovered more and more, pointing to design intelligence. The most logical conclusion from that is that there's a designer. So that is the theory we should take because it's the most logical and not, made up.
And that is a very scientific approach to a hypothesis, is what is in fact the best explanation for what we observe. And so if the best explanation is that there is design, intricate, complicated design in what we see, then it is a logical conclusion that there was a designer. Now, the people who are talking about intelligent designs, particularly Stephen Meyer, who is a Christian and admits and is honest about his Christianity, uses the term intelligent designer because he doesn't want, understandably, in the scientific community to take the focus off of what are we seeing? Does this look designed? Does it look like it's an intelligent design to God? Now that's the next step, and he is not bashful in his communication of that. But if you hear intelligent design, it is the idea that when I see and pass something that was created, I identify that. Now I'm not saying who created it, but we can, of course, say who created it because we know who created it. But in the scientific community, they simply say, yeah, that is complicated, that is complex, that is designed, and we have to admit that as we observe what we're observing.
Okay, completely consistent is the scripture, which through Genesis 1:26 says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds of the sky, over livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." In Job, he says, "Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one form us both within our mothers?" And then in Psalm 139, "For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made."
So the future for creation biologists is never like it's been before. It is exciting. The scientific community is revealing to us and them what we've known to be true all along. So as we delve into the inner workings of the cell and its complexity, we are all the more driven to intelligent design and God as the creator. We are not accidents, but purposeful beings with God's stamp on us. That knowledge gives us hope and purpose and a mind to eternity. And that is our goal, that as we've worked through these past weeks, and we're done with science as of today. So you can all take a breath, and we'll do something different than science next week. But the idea is that we, again, have an opportunity in this world that is crumbling scientifically and philosophically and socially to offer an explanation. And we can do it, and an answer, and we can do it because we're confident in what we believe. And we're confident not only just because it says it in the Bible, which is foundational, but because also things are being discovered that confirm what we know to be true. All right, so we've left a little time. I'm willing to hear your theological positions on theistic evolution or other comments or questions that you might have.
Thank you. Okay, so just on the subject of intelligent design, if you're working with somebody who isn't a professing Christian, but they are willing to accept the idea of intelligent design, I don't think we should just stop there.
Agreed.
Because it is incomplete. It says, yes, okay, we're willing to admit there is a God, but Muslim God could do, Roman pantheon could do, but it lacks the hope that we have in the gospel. It lacks being able to show why there's suffering and death in the world. So we shouldn't just take that as a win, but as an opportunity to share more.
I agree. Yeah, if we can get them to, yeah, this is created, then it's an easy to describe the Creator. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Do you know anything more about Lucy and like how we know if it's real or not?
Yeah, so Lucy doesn't have any feet. And so, at least in Lucy's fossil record. So right next to Lucy, and this was in Ethiopia, there are some footprints. And the same exact footprints occur about 600 miles away in Tanzania. So it remains, and also one of the ribs in Lucy is a baboon, I think. It's one of the primates. And so Lucy is the closest thing they have right now. But it is missing some things, and there's some things to explain, and that is, how do we have feet 600 miles away that are likely baboon, the exact same as next to Lucy? So that's why Lucy is having some troubles, but they're clinging to Lucy a little bit.
I'm a computer programmer, so I'd like to share my perspective on how I can appreciate the complexity of DNA and what's coded there. I'd like to read this short thing here. The Human Genome Project is a scientific research project with the aim to determine the sequence of human DNA. The ultimate goal is to map all the genes of the human genome. It is already the largest collaborative project in biology till date. The project started in 1990 and ended in 2003. The project was performed across 20 different universities. The software for analyzing the human genome and map the nucleotide base pairs of DNA took 3.3 trillion lines of code. In fact, the coding took more time than the actual execution of the project. 3.3 trillion lines of code. I mean, we're talking hundreds of people over 13 years. That's not the complexity of DNA itself. That's just the complexity to analyze the DNA and group it into genes and stuff. So evolution is talking about, okay, all these nucleotide base pairs are just sort of, just shake them in like a Yahtzee thing and pour it out, and then it just randomly came out into a perfect program that creates human beings. And that makes no sense whatsoever. No sense. It's obvious to anybody who can look at DNA and say, yes, this was intelligently coded. Somebody put that information there. It did not come out by itself, period.
Yeah, and I think that, as Shane said this morning in the sermon, if there are moments when our faith is troubled or our circumstances have caused us to wonder, for me, being in the scientific community, this offers me tremendous foundation to say, there is a God of the universe who created all of this incredible complexity. Shane?
Just to follow up on what Kevin was saying, the head of the Human Genome Project is also a committed Christian.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
I've got two things. One, I'm curious about you and your background. Did you come to believe in intelligent design later in life, or were you a believer early on and you were following that path, but you've learned science is confirming?
Yes, the
second,
latter. Yeah.
Okay. Just curiosity.
Yeah.
Second is I am a young Earth believer.
Yeah.
And all of my life, through education, I would hear about these different finds that seem to prove an old Earth, whether this stone or this bone or whatever they were finding in archaeology was so many years. But then later I heard that a lot of that was through a circular path where they said this was this old, and then they confirmed it by this, but then later they confirmed the second one by the first one. So is that still a thing, or where are they finding the old Earth confirmation, if at all?
Yeah, they're not. However, there are really brilliant Christian minds who are old Earth. I am young Earth as well. And we talked a little bit about historical science and assumptions. And so in historical science, what you do is you look at something that happened, the beginning of the Earth, and you assume that there are things that happened back then that happen now so that we can evaluate what happened back then based upon what we know now. So, for example, uranium degrades to lead, and we know how fast uranium degrades to lead. And so if you get a rock and you look at that rock and you say, all right, 50% of it is lead and 50% of it is uranium, we can then possibly figure out how old it is. The problem is you have to make the assumption that there was no lead in that rock to begin with. So already your assumption is based on something you can't possibly prove. I didn't go into it much last week because I'm not an expert in geology, but there are strong opinions on both sides of this topic in the Christian world. I like Genesis as it is. I like the intimacy of having a 6,000-year-old earth that God created and has been a part of for every nanosecond that has happened. But that's philosophical, and so don't shoot me.
I was just going to go back to Lucy for a moment. It's interesting, the more they find out about her and her muscle structure, the more they are finding the similarity shocking to that of a tree-climbing ape than that of a human, because the muscle similarities are not to that of a walking human, which is probably why they removed her feet, right? And so the more and more science is proving creation, right? It's a beautiful thing.
Well, they are highly motivated to find something that confirms their theology, and that is no God. Mike.
Back to the young earth and the old earth. Question, when God created Adam, did he have a belly button?
Absolutely. Everyone has a belly button.
Point is that God did create with apparent age, because obviously Adam couldn't have taken care of himself when he was a little baby. Therefore, that's in God's realm, not ours.
I agree. Yeah, maybe we can have dessert at our house and have 30 short or young Earth and 30 old Earth people, and we can just do it over a brownie or something. Yeah.
Excuse me, I came in late, but I think I mentioned to you about Creation Museum, not to pass that up. Yes. And also, if there's 1 or 2 books that you could recommend for people.
I would recommend Stephen Meyer YouTube videos, honestly. And he wrote Return of the God Hypothesis, which I think would be a very good read. And so maybe to answer your question, Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen Meyer would probably be the book that speaks to this the most. Yeah.
The scripture indicates that man separated from God is godless, and yet there is a need in him. Satan has us searching all kinds of things instead of just saying, I need to get back to God. All these things you're talking about are swirling this human society around trying to deny the one they need. When in Christ we are brought back to God, that's why Jesus came, to bring us back to God. And we see all these people, intelligent people in a great creation, swirling around in order to find a way to do what Satan wants to do, deny God. Now that you, brothers and sisters in the Lord, know there is a God through Christ, we don't want to get caught up in that swirl. We look at it, we look at it with compassion, because once we were there. But the commission for us is to get them to accept the one that can bring them back to God. We can argue those other things all over the place, but if we don't get to that point, we are missing it. And this is what's on my heart.
Yeah, I know. And the question is tactics, really, and that is, you're right, how do we get them to accept what we know to be true, and that is that God created us and that he sent his son when we fell to die. But how do we engage them is what we're trying to talk about here. And I'm with you. I don't think arguing anything is helpful. However, to engage can be extremely helpful. And if you have some foundational ideas about how to engage, then I think that's what you do. But I'm with you. That's our commission. Okay, one last one.
You were talking about entropy, and I was reminded of Romans 8, that creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage of decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. And Jessica was talking about like hope. Our world doesn't have any hope, and like when we get, the Spirit gives us that taste of us being glorified, like that the world will be glorified too, and that this is what science points to is just so hopeful. Yeah. So I wanted to point that out, we're not crumbling. We can break down the arguments and strongholds, but at the same time offer hope of liberation from that bondage of decay.
I think that's the entire point, and that is we have something to offer, and Can you imagine for just a moment being without the hope that we have? I mean, you wake up tomorrow and what you know to be true is gone, and you're looking for purpose, you're looking for answers, you're looking for what happens after this, and we have those answers. Have a nice day. Appreciate you coming.